Hi, everyone. This is Jimmy Huling, and I want to welcome you to this episode of Execution Insights. There's a central idea that exists in both the construction of a building and the construction of a life. It's what we call the through line. Now, in construction, a through line is the structural path that actually carries the weight of the building from top to the bottom. And if it's broken, even slightly, the whole structure of the building will weaken. But when it's intact, it stands for generations. And over the years, my work as a leader and a coach has shown me that this same idea, this through line, is true in a life. In fact, one of the most important lessons I ever learned about this came from a moment I thought would define my entire future. Stay with me for a minute. I'll tell you this entire story. So, when you look closely at a life, the same structure begins to appear because at the foundation is discovery. It's about recognizing the work that's truly yours to do in the world. And from that discovery comes direction, choosing the path that work you've discovered actually points you toward. And over time, the direction requires execution, the discipline to stay faithful to the work. And so when someone walks that path long enough, then something remarkable begins to happen. A legacy begins to be built. But here's the surprising truth. You almost never see that structure when you're looking forward. You only see it when you look back. And to illustrate this in the most personal way I can imagine, I want to take you back in my life almost 50 years. Yes, that's a long time, isn't it? When I was 22 years old, I stood on stage for a brief moment as the winner of the Metropolitan Opera regional auditions. It was a pinnacle moment in my life. And I can still remember that feeling, standing there and being young and hopeful and convinced that I was looking at the beginning of the life I had imagined as a professional singer. And if you had asked that young version of me what the future held, I would have been really quick to say, hey, I'm going to travel the world. I'm going to stand before thousands of people. I'm going to use my talent and my art in a powerful way. Well, as it turned out, 50 years later, everything I would have said on that day would be true, but it would not have been true in the way I imagined. Because at 22, I thought that moment was establishing the trajectory of my life. In other words, I thought I was seeing my through line, but I wasn't. I was only seeing the form of my life at that stage, not the structure. Now, I wasn't wrong about the gifts I had been given, and I wasn't wrong about the desire to use them in a meaningful or a creative way. I was just wrong about how they would be used. And I think the same thing is true for many of us. Now, since that day, I've coached more than 600 people across 7 countries, all of whom are wrestling with some of the questions that matter most. And these questions don't go away easily. They have to be answered at some point. Questions like, who am I? And what should I do with my life? And even if I'm doing something with my life, why am I not happy? Well, it turns out the answer almost always returns to this same place, the through line. In other words, the pattern beneath the circumstances. So if you're in a place in your own life or career right now where you're asking the deeper questions, I want to offer you one of the most important lessons my entire life has taught me. You can't see the architecture looking forward. You can only see it looking back. Now, some of you will remember that's what Steve Jobs said when he made the famous quote, you can't connect the dots looking forward. You can only connect them looking backward. Well, the 22-year-old version of me could never have imagined that the talent I had worked so hard in music school and through college to develop would one day become the through line of my life's work as a teacher and a speaker and a coach. You see, that insight was invisible as long as I was looking forward. It only became clear when I learned to look back. And that brings us to the most practical part of today's episode of Execution Insights. If the through line of your life is real, and I believe it is, then the clues to finding it are already present in your life. They reveal themselves when we begin asking the right questions. So for today, I want to offer you 4 questions that when I invite leaders to reflect on them, seem to produce remarkable insights. Ready? The first, when have I felt most alive in the work I was doing? Now let's be careful. We're not talking about being satisfied, and we're not talking about just being successful. When have I felt alive? When you collect those moments, when you sort of do an inventory of the path that brought you to today, you'll begin to see that where you felt fully engaged in the work, you could see something more important beginning to emerge. You could begin to see the through line. Now, second, how have I been uniquely gifted to do that work? In other words, once you've got a sense of where you felt it, then look for the moments when those strengths showed up naturally. For example, what abilities seem to come easily to you, and yet they make a difference in the lives of other people? Sometimes the gifts that shape our lives are the ones we overlook, simply because to us, they're just natural. They're things that we do automatically. The third question, why does the work seem to matter so deeply to me? Have you ever sensed when you're doing something that even though on the surface it may not seem all that important, to you, it was a big deal? The way you did it mattered. You had a sense of a larger purpose as you were doing it. Well, when you think about those moments, think about, who was I drawn to help? What message was I compelled to deliver? Or understanding what you did, well, that's only the beginning. But understanding why it mattered, well, that's where the treasure is. And fourth and last, what impact did I create? You know, a very wise teacher once told me that every achievement should be followed by 2 simple words. The 2 words, so what? Now, he wasn't teaching me this to dismiss the achievement. In fact, I think he was teaching me this to elevate the achievement, because he was asking me to be clear in anything I had accomplished, what difference it had made. For example, did it help someone else to grow? Did it move a team forward? Did it raise the level of optimism or hope in an entire group? You see, purpose reveals itself in the evidence it leaves behind. So when you and I step back and we reflect on these 4 questions, and by the way, let me just remind you of them really quickly. When did I feel most alive? How was I gifted? Why did it matter? And what impact did I create? Those are the 4 questions that will get you started. Well, then you can begin to see something remarkable. You begin to see the through line that has very likely been there all along. And if this kind of reflection makes you thoughtful, makes you want to work on it, even perhaps makes you want some help, I want you to know this is exactly the work I do with leaders every single day of my life. I have a process that I call the Life Alignment Review. It takes about 90 minutes and is often incredibly revealing. Now, for today, I just want to encourage you to take the next few moments and step back and begin to ponder these questions. See if they can help you align your vision, develop a strategy, get energy to execute, and become thoughtful about the legacy that you're leaving behind. These are the kinds of things that come from this exercise. Now, to finish today's episode, I can't help but tell you that several years ago, I had a full circle moment on this memory of winning those singing auditions. Now, in this version, I happen to be on the other side of the world in a country far from my home. I also happen to be standing in front of 10,000 people who had gathered to hear me give a speech about impact and purpose in business and in life. And the thing that struck me as I was standing on that stage, looking out across all of those faces gathered in this massive ballroom, something unexpected happened. In that exact moment, I remembered that young singer standing on a stage who was once me, who was convinced he understood what his life was going to be. And for just a moment, all the years of my life collapsed into a single thought. Yes, I was on a different stage, and yes, I was delivering a different message, but it was the same through line. I was still using my gifts to bring a message or to generate hope, or in this case, to uplift and inspire. You see, I hadn't lost the dream. I had grown into it. Now, it wasn't in the way I imagined at 22, but I want to tell you, it was in the way I was designed for. And that's what I want for each of you. Not a perfect prediction of what your future holds, not a flawless path, but instead the courage to discover step by step what your own through line is and to follow it. Because when you discover the work that is truly yours to do, as I have today by being a coach and an author, when you choose that clear direction, when you execute it with discipline, when you stay faithful to it over time, I promise you this, the legacy of your life begins to rise. And like a building constructed for the ages, your life will stand steady and visible and strong, and it will inspire everyone who sees it. So remember, you can never connect the dots looking forward, but when we look back, we can often see the through line that's been there all along. And the more we live in alignment with that through line, the greater our life, our legacy, and our joy will always be. I hope you've enjoyed this episode of Execution Insights, and I look forward to seeing you on the next episode.